I took on the role of being the naval historian for the group, and I made 12 presentations over the years, one a year for 12 years. And these presentations really educated me to the important and often overlooked portion of the war that belonged to the Union and the Confederate Navy. They made important contributions to the war effort on both sides. And this is one small corner of that naval tradition by the Confederate Navy. And I'll explain how the Alabama came to be and what its purpose was. But it really demonstrated that the South was able to think outside the box because they had such limited resources as a way of countering the overwhelming resources that the Union had. In the last 6 years, I've made some of those presentations that I made in Rockford. I've also begun to make here. I've done the Monitor and the Merrimack duel, the Hunley submarine that the South developed, the Battle of Mobile and the Battle of New Orleans that Admiral Farragut was so important in, and the development of the Union Navy of a brown water navy. That is, a navy that operated on the rivers, the Mississippi primarily, but not on the open ocean where they had traditionally, of course, been present. But they had to develop a whole new capability to fight in the brown water of the rivers. With that background, first, we're going to look at some of the familiar faces that, if anybody's been to my past presentations, they'll remember. And there's one or two new ones as well. Here's a familiar face, Gideon Welles, who was the Union Secretary of the Navy. The Secretary of the Navy was a cabinet position during the Civil War, along with the Secretary of War, who was in charge of land operations. Gideon Welles, as his counterpart, was in charge of the Navy. He was affectionately called the Father Neptune as a nickname given to him by President Lincoln. And he was the principal architect of the northern strangulation of southern ports by the blockade, known as the Anaconda Plan. This plan was intended to prevent the export of southern cotton, which could be sold for the badly needed supplies of ammunition, clothing, and other vital war materials that were otherwise unobtainable in the South. For the North, the blockade problem was straightforward. It was simply a matter of building up a huge Union Navy from a very meager beginning and at the outset of the hostilities. For the North, the availability of the resources necessary for this build-up, made the effective implementation of the Anaconda Plan only a matter of time. As we will see, the Union Navy grew large enough to both effectively blockade the southern ports, but also large enough to counter the southern threat of the Alabama and other commerce raiders by detaching vessels from the blockade to pursue the southern ships known as commerce raiders, or as the northern press liked to describe them as pirates. The Alabama was the most infamous of these southern raiders. Here's another familiar face from some of my presentations. His counterpart in the South was Stephen Mallory, the Confederate Secretary of the Navy. From the beginning of his naval policies, he had to struggle to thwart and counter the Union blockade of the South's ports. To his credit, his innovative ship designs, such as the Merrimack, which was developed and was fought against the Monitor, and his ingenuity in the face of scarce resources did much to strengthen the Southern cause. His solution to the Anaconda Plan was essentially threefold. One, it was the ironclad program, developing new ironclad ships to destroy the blockading ships. Two, he developed swift blockade runners to evade the blockade and bring supplies in and out. And third, he developed the plan of the commerce raiders to destroy the North's commercial shipping on the high seas and divert Union Navy units from blockading unit duties to search for these raiders. It was to fulfill this third role, which was the most successful of Mallory's strategies, that the Alabama was built. It was thought that destruction of New England's vital maritime commerce would force Lincoln to a peace negotiation. This hope of a negotiated peace never occurred, largely because President Lincoln had a determination not to bow to any such pressure. Here's a new face. James Bullock was the enterprising Confederate naval agent sent to Britain with the task of procuring ships for the war from the Liverpool-based Laird shipbuilding firm. At the outset of hostilities, he was sent immediately to England, specifically Liverpool, where he arrived in June of 1861 at the overseas offices of the Charleston, South Carolina firm of Fraser Trenholm and Company, which firm had been the cotton merchants for the South, for the Southern exporters, to the many of the Liverpool textile mills that took the cotton and turned it into cloth. That firm became the South's financial agents during the war. And it was through this firm that Bullock obtained the Confederate money necessary to pay for the Alabama. Because the English Neutrality Acts forbid English shipyards from building warships for other countries, the need for secrecy and deception in the building of the Alabama was extremely important. For this reason, Bullock signed the contract for the ship in his own name in August of '61 for 47,000 pounds, about $250,000. As well, the ship was known as Hull 290 during construction, and originally was designated with the spurious name Enrica, ostensibly to be a merchant vessel. On the site of Liverpool, besides Bullock, however, was Thomas Dudley, who was the American consul in Liverpool, the northern delegate. And he was not fooled, because he had numerous reports from his private detectives about the ultimate warlike nature of this building. His numerous protests were relayed first to Charles Francis Adams, the U.S. ambassador to England, who spoke directly to Lord John Russell, the Foreign Secretary of the Queen. But those protests were to no avail. Lord Russell apparently took the expansive view of the neutrality laws, replying that as long as the ship was not equipped with guns in English territorial waters, then he could do nothing. This attitude was in part based on the fact that the lack of southern cotton had idled many of the Liverpool textile mills, and the workmen needed the shipyard jobs to prevent an economic collapse. As well, Lord Russell wanted to favor the South, at least until it became clear who was going to win, in order to advance the power of Britain by having its major rival power cut into two less formidable opponents. Before we move on to the next slide, there's an interesting fact about this fellow Bullock. He was the uncle of Teddy Roosevelt, as his sister was Teddy Roosevelt's mother. Now let's take a look at the work done to build Hull 290. This map of southern England and northern France shows the places where the Alabama began and ended her career. I have a laser pointer here in the room. The people on Zoom can't see where I'm pointing to, but Liverpool is up near the top on the left on the Irish Sea, and Cherbourg is at the end of the long peninsula on the coast of France. Let's see, wait a minute, not too far. Here, laser pointer there. Liverpool's up here, and Cherbourg is on the peninsula at the tip of the top of France there. This engraving shows the Mersey River on the west coast of England, with the thriving city of Liverpool on the top and the shipyard of the Laird brothers on the opposite bank to the south in the industrial city of Birkenhead. The offices of Fraser Trenholm, where Bullock had his office, is shown at G over in the left-hand corner just north of the river. And the office of Thomas Dudley, the American consul, is shown at J, barely 2 blocks away. Liverpool was the world center for shipbuilding in the 19th century. 100 years would pass before the world knew it also as the home of the Beatles. This picture here is a drawing of the ships depicted being built in the Laird Works, looking across the Mersey towards the shipyard. It graphically shows why Laird was the premier shipbuilder in the world, as it had tremendous engineering and technical expertise, which could not be duplicated anywhere else. Notice the slipways on the left for the construction of the hulls, and the dry docks on the right for the hulls to be outfitted with all additional equipment. Machinery such as boilers and engines were manufactured behind the waterside facilities, where you see all the smokestacks, and could be easily moved by the yard's cranes to be installed in the ships. And here's a plan taken from the Laird shipbuilding files that shows the ship as it was originally built, without any provision for cannons to disguise its true nature and to satisfy the neutrality laws of England. Bullock had separately arranged to buy the cannon and ammunition in London and have them put aboard another ship to join the Enrica outside of British waters. This subterfuge was effective, for although the Union Consul Dudley had many reports of the warlike role of the Enrica, his proof was circumstantial and insufficient to convince Lord Russell to seize the ship. Here's a very good cutaway of the Enrica, soon to be renamed. Note the placement of the two pivot guns. The first gun is just forward of the smokestack. You can see it in between those two ventilator ducts that are sticking up. And the other large gun is between the main and the aft mizzen mast, a little more clearly shown there. In one forward of the smokestack was a 7-inch rifled Blakely gun, which fired a shell that weighed 110 pounds. The other gun between the two masts, the two aft masts, was an 8-inch smoothbore, not rifled, and only fired cannonballs, a 68-pound ball. The other armament on the Alabama were 6 32-pounders, which were positioned 3 on one side, 3 on the other side at gun ports. While the two big guns, which are normally stowed and secured on the ship's center line, could be swung to either side by an ingenious set of sweeps that allowed the guns to point in any direction, whereas the side pointing 32-pounders could only be moved a few degrees left or right. The Alabama was 220 feet long, had a beam of 32 feet, and was powered by 2 steam engines of a total 600 horsepower. She drew 17 feet loaded and weighed 1,000 tons. Because iron ships were in their infancy, repairs to such ships could only be made in shipyards with sophisticated engineering, which basically meant only the Laird yard. Consequently, the Alabama was wood with copper sheathing. The steam engine was advanced for its time with 2 cylinders of 56-inch diameter, more than 4 feet wide, driving the propeller at 65 revolutions per minute. The coal-powered boilers were terribly inefficient, however. Although she carried 350 tons of coal, that was only enough for 18 days of steaming under that power. So sails were used almost exclusively to conserve the coal supply unless extra speed was needed in a chase. She was bark rigged, which means that the lower sails were rigged fore and aft, while the upper sails were rigged across square to the boat. She was capable of 15 knots and was thus a swift and dangerous, ideal for her role. This model view of the propeller illustrates an innovative design which was introduced during the transition period of shipbuilding between sail and steam. When sailing, the 13-foot diameter propeller could be disconnected from the shaft to the engine and lifted straight up out of the water to reduce drag, and lowered again and connected to the shaft when under steam power. A terrific idea in the transition period between sail and steam. The Enrica was launched in May of '62, further outfitted with engines and boilers and ready for sea by the next month, June, after testing the boilers at the dock. The first trial ran the ship out to the Form B lighthouse, shown at the top of this map, from the Liverpool and shipyard down at the lower right-hand corner. And then after returning to the yard for final fitting of and receipt of stores and filling the coal bunkers, Those tests proceeded through July. And at this time, an English captain, Matthew Butcher of the Cunard Line, was appointed to raise the necessary crew with the secret understanding that he would be replaced by a Confederate captain and officers once outside English waters. Because Bullock feared seizure of the ship for violation of the neutrality laws, he pushed for an early disguised sailing. And on July 29th, the Enrica sailed ostensibly for further trials, crammed with dignitaries, guests, and shipyard workers to conceal its intention not to return. The ship spent the day running between the Bell Buoy and the Northwest Lightship, up in the upper left of this picture. And at 3 p.m., Bullock announced that he wanted to keep the ship out all night and asked all of the guests and workmen to disembark to the shipyard tender which accompanied the trial. Bullock left also, instructing Captain Butcher to take the ship to Mulfree Bay, where he would rejoin it the next day with the last crew members. Here's a little bit larger map of the same area. Liverpool down on the left, Mulfree Bay over on the in the middle and near the bottom, where the Enrica spent the night waiting for Bullock to rejoin it. And with a full complement of crew, the ship sailed north around the north coast of Ireland. Bullock disembarked at the Giant's Causeway, the tip of Ireland, to return to his duties in Liverpool, and the Enrica was directed to proceed to the Azores, where it was to meet up with the vessel that Bullock had contracted to carry the ordnance to equip the soon-to-be renamed Alabama. Now's the important part of the Alabama's life, its voyage. Almost 2 years, 22 months, from August of 62 until June of 64. Here's a close-up of the ordnance, the most important piece of ordnance on the Alabama. An advanced design of rifled cannon, ideal for long-range battles, long-distance targets. This Blakely gun was recovered from the wreck by French divers in June of 1994 and was found to be loaded. Explosives experts defused the shell by removing the percussion-type fuse with a specially designed tool. The gun was positioned forward of the funnel and could fire solid shot or explosive shells. It was a very devastating long-range gun. However, because breech-loading guns had not yet been introduced, and by breech-loading I mean loading at the back rather than pushing the powder and the shell into the barrel from the front. Breech-loading guns had not yet been introduced. Both this gun and the smoothbores required a crew of 20 men to clean, load, aim, turn, and run out these 8,000-pound behemoths in and out for firing. This picture shows one of the 32-pounders that were mounted on the side that had very little ability to traverse left or right. These were the traditional and rapidly becoming obsolete smoothbores that threw a cannonball of about 150 pounds. They were smashers. They were designed to knock holes in the wooden hulls of their opponents. But with the age of iron ships advancing, these cannonballs no longer could penetrate, as was demonstrated by the duel between the Monitor and the Merrimack. So By replacing the wooden ships with iron ships, these smooth bores and the wooden ships that held them were rapidly becoming obsolete, something ending a tradition of wooden ships that lasted for thousands of years. This drawing shows another type of ammunition which could be used besides solid shot and shell. This was called Grape Shot, which consisted of 16 small iron balls, each slightly less than 4 inches in diameter, held together by a metal frame. The head-on view shows that the 4 balls had the same diameter as the cannon barrel through which it would be fired. But when fired, the frame came apart, and the balls acted as a devastating sweep across a crowded enemy's deck or to cut rigging. Range was limited, but in a close fight, the balls could cover a wider area, much like a shotgun, and do greater damage to sailors, rather than just the battering of the ship itself, which was the primary purpose of the solid shot and shell. Here's the master of the Alabama, Raphael Sims, the first and only captain of the Alabama. After he resigned his U.S. Navy commission at the beginning of the war, he helped Secretary Mallory find available ships in southern ports suitable for conversion into commerce raiders, while the Alabama was being readied in Britain. Sims was a lawyer and knew that the international law that would govern his activities as commander of the raider were basically of 3 options available to him if he stopped another ship. 1, if the ship and cargo were both Union, it could be seized and taken to a southern port for condemnation or burned. Because southern ports were not open to him, burning was the fate of these northern ships exclusively. 2, if the ship was neutral and the cargo Union, the ship had to go free. And 3, if the ship was Union and the cargo neutral, the ship could be bonded, which was a promise to pay the value of the ship to the South after the war, if it won, and then the ship would be released. The principles were simple, but the application gave Sims maximum flexibility. He served as both prosecutor and judge of the application of these rules, as these decisions were made on the high seas with no review. However, he did realize the danger of making negligent errors which would anger foreign neutral shippers or their governments, and he did on occasion conclude that ships had to be released, though not often, if the facts in the papers were ambiguous. Armed with these legal precedents, he resented the charges of the northern press that he was a pirate. Captain Sims is in the center here with his officers. He was sent to Nassau to await command of a blockade runner originally, but after the Alabama was purchased and was being built, he was given that assignment and waited in Nassau for the completion of the building. This is the commission for Sims, signed by Jefferson Davis, appointing him as captain of the Alabama in June of 1862. And here's the voyage. After sailing from Liverpool, up at the top in the middle, the Enrica made its way to Praia in the Azore Islands. in the Atlantic near the coast of Spain to meet up with the ship that Bullock had engaged to carry all the ordnance and ammunition separately so as to not endanger the fragile interpretation of the neutrality law. At the same time, Captain Sims, who had received his appointment to command the Alabama while in Nassau, sailed to Liverpool to join the Alabama, but arrived after it had left. So he turned around with Bullock and sailed after it to meet up with the Enrica in the Azores. And in August of '62, Sims relieved Captain Butcher of his command of the Enrica, and by August 24th, all the loading of the arms and ammunition was completed, and at this point, Sims renamed the ship CSS Alabama and recruited 80 of the crews from Liverpool and the ships that had brought him and the guns to the Azores. And although he was undermanned at the beginning of the voyage, he easily recruited additional sailors that he needed from the crews of the various ships that he had captured or from the ports that he visited. The transformation then complete in the Azores, the voyage of destruction began. As shown on the map, he first headed west across the Atlantic. And in September, 9 whalers and grain ships between the Azores and New England were destroyed. Between October and November, 10 more vessels along the east coast, all the way down to Martinique in the Caribbean. The Alabama surviving a hurricane during this part of the voyage, and escaping at night and in a rainstorm from a Union warship by trying to block the Alabama in the harbor at Martinique. In December, sailing west farther into the Gulf of Mexico, the mail steamer Ariel was captured off Cuba with 500 of passengers and a contingent of U.S. Marines. We'll see some pictures of some of these captures. Unlike the other ships which were burned after necessary supplies were removed, the Ariel was bonded, which was the contract to pay a set sum of money. In January of '63, just off of Galveston, Texas, the Alabama sank the smaller side-wheeler gunboat, the USS Hatteras. When that ship left the Galveston blockade to investigate the smoke that showed that the Alabama was approaching. This was the first time in history that a steam warship had sunk another steam warship. In January and August of '63, all the way the first 8 months of the year '63, 25 ships destroyed in the Atlantic and farther south along the coast of Brazil and in the South Atlantic. In August, reprovisioning in Cape Town, South Africa, and barely evading another Union warship while leaving port. In September or November of '63, across the Indian Ocean, 6 ships destroyed while sailing towards Singapore. In December of '63, in Singapore, getting provisions. And in January to May of '64, retracing its steps across the Indian Ocean, back to Cape Town for supplies, back up north through the South Atlantic, the North Atlantic, to Cherbourg. The activities of the Alabama were widely reported in the newspapers of the North, particularly in Harper's Weekly, an illustrated newspaper of the time. And this print of November of '62 depicts the burning of the Brilliant in the background on the right. Burning was the usual fate of the captured ships, although sometimes ships were bonded in order to relieve the Alabama of all the prisoners that it had to take aboard when the ships were burned. Here's a picture that depicts the Alabama in a hurricane off the east coast in October of '62, early in the voyage. Considerable skill was required to avoid damage, as repairs were very difficult when friendly ports were hard to find and good repair facilities even harder to find. The effectiveness of the Alabama really depended on its ability to move, and to move quickly to avoid pursuers. Captain Sims did not want to be caught in port for repairs. Here's another illustration of the time of the capture of the mail steamer Ariel off the Cuban coast. And here's a depiction of the Alabama sinking the Hatteras, a Union warship, off the Texas coast at Galveston. This is a better depiction of the attack on the Hatteras because the attack really took place at night. And this accurately shows how difficult it would be to fight at night. The Alabama was able to get so close to the Hatteras that one or two broadsides sank the Hatteras in about 13 minutes. Here's Captain Sims leaning on the midship 8-inch Blakely gun. This photograph is part of a series taken at Cape Town, South Africa in August of '63 during the Alabama's voyage out. The executive officer, Lieutenant Kell, K-E-L-L, is in the background. Kell is an interesting figure in his own right. He entered the first class of the Naval Academy in 1841 and served for nearly 20 years before being dismissed in a dispute with his captain. Sims, as a lawyer, offered to defend Kell, but was unsuccessful. When the war started, Sims immediately contacted Kell to be his first officer, his first lieutenant on the Alabama. Now here comes the end of the voyage and the destruction of the Alabama. This is a picture of the Kearsarge, Union warship, built in 1861 in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, as part of the wartime Union Navy building program. It was about the same size as the Alabama, but more ruggedly built and considerably heavier, as speed was not as important as strength. Nevertheless, it had a larger engine and could steam at almost the same speed as the Alabama. This is a picture on board the Kearsarge showing one of its two 11-inch cannons. These were larger than anything the Alabama had, but did not have the range of the 8-inch Blakely gun. If it was going to be a long-range duel, the Kearsarge was in trouble. Otherwise, these two 11-inch cannons were massive smashers, any one of which cannonball that threw could go straight through the Alabama, making a hole as big as a doorway. A long-range duel would have favored the Alabama, but up close, the Kearsarge was definitely favored. Here's Captain John Winslow, who took command of the Kearsarge in late '63. For a year and a half, he had searched for Sims who he had known personally as they served together in the Mexican War on the ship. He had searched in the English Channel, which was his territory, to try to find the Alabama, until while in port in Flushing, Holland, just up the coast in France, he was notified by telegraph that the Alabama had docked at Cherbourg. The Kearsarge immediately upped anchor and steamed at full speed to the scene. Promoted as a Commodore as a result of his victory, Winslow became a Rear Admiral in 1870 and later commanded the Pacific Squadron. He was a war hero, no doubt. Here's Captain Winslow and his officers on the Kearsarge. Of particular note, these iron strips on the deck in front of him. These were the pivot strips by which the cannons could be traversed left and right in order to fire in any direction. They required, however, a crew of about 20 people to do the work, because it all had to be done by hand. These monsters weighed about 8 tons apiece and had to be moved solely by hand, and any assistance with the shifting was essential. The Alabama had similar sweeps for its 2 large cannon as well. The Alabama anchored in the harbor at Cherbourg on June 11, 1964, in need of major overhaul, repairs, and provisions. She had been at sea for 22 months with only brief stops. Delayed from initiating needed repairs until permission to dock was received from the French Foreign Office, the Alabama was trapped when the Kearsarge arrived on June 14th. On June 16th, in a characteristic Southern gentleman chivalric gesture which evidenced Sims' dignity, honor, and pride, but which ignored the fact that the Alabama was far more valuable in its role as a raider than as an antagonist to a heavily armed warship. Sims sent a boat out to the Kearsarge with the following note, quote, "Captain Winslow, sir, I am undergoing a few repairs here, which I hope will not take longer than the morrow. Then I will come out and fight you a fair and square fight. Captain R. Sims," close quote. On paper, the ships were evenly balanced in size, but the Kearsarge had several significant advantages. One, its crew was professional and highly trained sailors who had extensive training in gunnery. Two, the 2 11-inch Dahlgren guns on the Kearsarge were far heavier, throwing a shot of 430 pounds versus the 360-pound ball of the Alabama. And third, Winslow draped heavy iron chain over the sides of his ship to give his ship rudimentary armor plating. On the other hand, the Alabama had several serious deficiencies. One, she had been built for speed and was not as ruggedly constructed as the Kearsarge. Two, the Alabama had been chasing unarmed merchantmen and had relied on intimidation rather than firepower to capture its prey, so that the crew of the Alabama was not trained in accurate and sustained gunnery. Three, the powder of the Alabama was 2 years old, unable to get any supplies from any of the unarmed captured merchantmen. And the old and sometimes decomposed powder was prone to misfires and failure to explode. The only advantage was in the Blakely gun, which could be a distinct advantage if the battle were long range. In a close encounter, the Kearsarge would be devastating, and so it proved. Late in the morning on June 19th, the Alabama steamed out of the harbor and the two ships moved away from the coast to stay outside the French territorial limit. When the Kearsarge turned towards the Alabama, the battle began with the Alabama's Blakely gun at a 1-mile range. The Kearsarge, however, closed swiftly, and the two circled around each other 7 times at about 900 yards range, with the accurate guns of the Kearsarge hitting the Alabama numerous times, flooding the engine room so that headway was lost. Sinking rapidly, Sims ran up a white flag after about an hour and abandoned ship. The surrounding witnessing ships from the port picked up survivors, and Sims, with Lieutenant Kell and 41 sailors, was rescued by a British yacht, the Deerhound, and Sims was landed the next day on Southampton, England, across the Channel, escaping capture. The Kearsarge had fired 173 times, killing 9 Alabama crew members and another 12 drowned. The Alabama fired 370 times, but only managed to wound 3 of the Kearsarge. This is a map of the actual battle itself, the tracks of the two ships. The Alabama steamed out of the Cherbourg harbor at the bottom and met the Kearsarge at the upper right. The two ships circled each other 7 times before the Alabama lost power and began to sink. The heavier guns of the Kearsarge and the close range doomed the Alabama. Here's another depiction of the battle as the boats circled each other. And here's a depiction of the sinking of the Alabama and the Deerhound in the middle, the English yacht, to witness the battle, picking up survivors, including Sims. More French vessels who had come out to watch the battle, picking up other survivors. And here's a depiction of one of the Kearsarge Gun Crews celebrating the sinking of the Alabama in the background. Note beside the gun on the deck, there's one of these Grape Shot shells that you can see there, and a solid shot cannonball behind it. The 2 kinds of ammunition that were used in that cannon. Here's a picture of the Deerhound, the English yacht, that picked up Sims and 41 of the sailors and took them to Southampton to evade Winslow's capture. The battle with the Kearsarge was not the end of the Alabama's notoriety, even though the ship was on the bottom of the English Channel. This picture of Captain Sims was taken at Southampton, England, just days after the battle. Ambassador Adams protested that Sims and his men were prisoners of war, but Lord Russell, the Foreign Secretary, ruled that they had never been physically taken by Winslow and rejected the claim. Sims went on a 6-week holiday to Europe, finally sailed to Mexico and traveled overland back into the South, where he was given command of the James River Squadron trying to protect Richmond from Grant's assault at the last half of 1864 and early 65. When Lee had to evacuate Richmond. Sims destroyed his ships on the James River and was transferred to be a brigadier general of the Southern Army. I don't know of any other officer who held commissions in both the Army and the Navy. After the war was over, he was arrested, but President Johnson pardoned him in April of '66. The end of the war brought a public outcry by Northern merchants over the destruction caused by the Alabama. Their anger was directed at the British who had built the raider. For example, insurance rates soared 900% during the war because insurers lost so much cargo. As a result, a lengthy court case ensued, which became known as the Alabama claims, although the damage of other raiders was included as well. In the end, pursuant to the 1871 Treaty of Washington that sent the dispute to a Geneva Court of Arbitration, an award to the U.S. of $15 million was made, almost half of which was attributable to the destruction done by the Alabama. Although the U.S. won the case, Britain considered it a small price to pay to regain the dominance in world trade by the destruction of its main merchant rival fleet. By the way, before I finish with Captain Sims here, as a contemporary side note, I read in the paper recently that the city of Mobile has removed a statue of Captain Sims from a city park, deeming it to be an offensive reminder of slavery in the Civil War, something that has been happening in a number of cities across the South. Okay, to return to our story. In summary, the Alabama was at sea for 534 of its 657-day life and boarded 447 vessels, took 2,000 prisoners, captured and burned or bonded 66 Union ships worth more than $6 million. Her voyage of destruction covered 75,000 miles, and during her voyage, not one man was lost to accident or disease, a tribute to the seamanship and leadership of Sims and his officers. The Alabama never touched a southern point because of the blockade. It should be remembered that the Alabama, although the most famous raider, had 9 counterparts that sailed primarily in the South Atlantic and the Pacific, also seeking and destroying northern shipping. In total, these commerce raiders destroyed 245 Union merchantmen and probably diverted as many as 50 Union warships from blockading duties to pursue these commerce raiders all over the oceans of the world. In 1984, a French minesweeper found the Alabama in 200 feet of water. The Blakely cannon was recovered, as we saw earlier, in 1993. The ship's bell with the motto, "God helps those who help themselves," was recovered in 2002. A joint French-American team conducts recovery operations each summer. There's one final set of pictures I couldn't omit from this story. In June of 2005, 15 years ago, I visited a friend who lived across the river from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, the city where the Kearsarge was built in 1861. I was certain that the city had a Civil War monument, and I found this beauty in a downtown park. The 4 sides commemorate the important battles in which Portsmouth's soldiers and sailors participated: Gettysburg, Chancellorsville, Antietam, and the 4th side of the monument bears the Kearsarge name and this image of a sailor. The statue was erected in 1888. Here's a close-up of the Kearsarge sailor on the fourth side of the monument. As far as I know, no one's taken this one down. That's the end of my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Mr. Brimmer, turn this off? Yep. Oh, I'm sorry. Questions?
What do you know about the submarines that existed in the Civil War?
Well, I made a presentation within the last 5 years here about the Hunley, which was the South submarine that was developed in Mobile and then used in Charleston's harbor. And that's the only submarine that I'm aware of that saw action. There was some work on developing other submarines, but that was the only one that actually was deployed. Hunley, Hunley, named after the man who financed it. And it's now it was found after it sunk a Union ship, it disappeared. And in 1995, it was found in the sand off Charleston Harbor, raised, and it's now on display in a museum in Charleston. Well worth the trip. Fabulous, fabulous restoration of.
Article in the
I have no doubt. The Hunley was such a dramatic advance in technology as a warfare weapon that it's been fascinating to follow the restoration as well as the history of it. Any questions from my Zoom audience?
Yes, I have some questions.
All right, this is my son in California. He's always an irritant to my conversations. Go ahead.
All right. I have 3 questions. Number 1, how long did it take to build the ship from start to finish?
Well, let's see. They signed the contract in August of '61, and it was on the ocean by June the next year.
And so if the U.S. consul was not able to stop the construction, did they ever consider attempting to sabotage the construction?
He tried to infiltrate the men that were being recruited to crew to see whether or not he could have some inside information about the purposes of the boat. But he never tried sabotage. All he was trying to do was to gather enough evidence to convince Lord Russell to seize the ship as a warship in violation of the neutrality laws. I don't think he would have attempted sabotage, because that would have been on English soil, that would have been a pretty dangerous thing to do.
Okay, so second question. It was at sea for approximately 22 months, never went back to the south, and eventually sunk off the coast of France. In all of that time, where did they get their food and their ammunition during those 22 months?
Well, before he burned ships, he took everything he needed as far as supplies. The only supply he was unable to get off of these captured ships was gunpowder, because all the merchant ships were unarmed. But he got all the water and all the food that he needed from the ships that he captured.
Okay, so now last question. The Lord Russell said, I had imagined something to the effect of, England is neutral. Anybody who wants to build a ship in Liverpool is entitled to build a ship. We have no quarrel with the U.S. Civil War. Something to that effect, right?
Did he say that no quarrel with either side?
Well, the English government's position was basically, I'm going to play both sides until it becomes a little clearer how this war was going to end. On one hand, they wanted the flow of cotton to feed the Liverpool textile mill. On the other hand, their relations with the North were financial and economic, and they realized that perhaps the strengths of the North were going to overcome the South. So they tried to play both sides, and it took a while before it became clear to Lord Russell that it wasn't going to do any good to try to continue to support the South.
Okay, but their position was England is neutral, right?
Yes, they were neutral during the whole of the war, and I think you might remember that one of the diplomatic efforts of the South was to send ambassadors over to these countries to argue their cases. But in most cases, the countries to which they were sent, England and France, ignored these Southern ambassadors as being not entitled to diplomatic status as ambassadors.
Okay, but here's really the crux of my question. England asserts that it is neutral, but the ship is built in England. The cannons came separately from a different part of England and then were affixed to the ship. It visited ports in South Africa and Singapore, which were both British ports. When the ship was sunk, the crew was rescued by an English yacht and brought back to England. And ultimately, the destruction of all of the ships, the U.S. northern ships, the destruction of the U.S. Commercial shipping by the Alabama ultimately favored the English, because the English were then left with the only commercial shipping that could travel across the seas. So my question is, are they really neutral, or were they doing everything possible to favor the South in terms of the construction, the resupply, and the protection of the Alabama's crew?
Well, I think you could find historians that will argue about the actual diplomatic position of the English government at that time as being complicated. They were uncertain at the beginning which side they should back, and it was difficult to articulate a way that they could navigate between these two powers. So they tried to stay as neutral as they could, but they also had self-interest in mind, and they said, we're going to help if it looks like it's going one way, we'll help it go that way.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, the topic. Well, I can't repeat it. No. Anyway, I think what you're trying to say is that the topic of slavery made the diplomacy of the period very difficult and complicated. there were divisions in England between, as you say, the workers who were very much opposed to slavery and the upper classes who had made fortunes on slavery in the past. So it wasn't a topic that was easily discussed in England at the time, and it made Lord Russell's job very difficult. Well, they had abolished slavery more than 50 years previously, and even in their colonies, and the Union Navy before the war had cooperated with the British Navy in suppressing the slave trade by squadrons that patrolled along the African coast to intercept the slave ships. But, you know, there was still a tremendous amount of slavery and slave labor that was necessary to operate the British colonies in the Caribbean, in Jamaica particularly, and the others. Then I think we've done it. Thanks for joining us,
Thank you, Dick.
and we'll see you later. Bye bye.
Yeah.
Thank you.